Here we go. Good evening. What a great group to come out on a truly stunning evening. I'm guessing for some you didn't want to stick around out of joy after the Browns game, though, so that makes it a little bit easier. We are starting this series on Hear My Story. And as we talked about the importance of listening to a whole variety of stories, it really made sense to at least start that this isn't about some other agenda. This is about a faith initiative. It's about what are we called to do in our faith, and we need to begin by understanding why we need to listen to story of one another, of those we don't know, based on being people of the Christian faith. So we got two great clergy and me, and we've got Derry, our host. Derry, who has been a part of this church since the early 1990s, a superintendent of schools, headed up an education initiative in Akron, and is just a gifted soul, and we're grateful to have him throughout the series. He's going to be the one hosting each of the speakers. Joy Fenton-Jones, who some of you may remember, has been connected to this church for over 20 years in some fashion or another, starting here working with our children's music. Well, actually starting here with Saturday night service and then children's music, many other iterations. She's now the pastor of both Pilgrim UCC in Cuyahoga Falls and First Christian Church in Cuyahoga Falls. Also works with the United Methodist Church in church development, and also is working with us on First Serve.
It's a lot of churches.
And Andrew Taylor Peck, who is the pastor of Trinity UCC in Canton, and who I've known now for about 8 or 9 years. Both are just two people who I really trust, have wonderful voices, and we're so fortunate to have their thoughts to be shared with us tonight. So welcome, thank you to each of you, and Derry, it's all on you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. What we'll do is I just have a series of questions that we're going to ask, and sometimes we'll ask all three to respond, other times perhaps just one person. So this first one is, we'd like you to share with us a biblical story or scripture that is a basis for helping us understand why it's important as Christians to hear others' stories. So whoever gives me eye contact first, Andrew.
So we did talk about this in advance, and we thought there was an order. Yeah. I wanted to be last, but the passages we ended up with made sense that it happened in a different order. So I'm going to start with a passage early in Scripture, back in Genesis, and the idea of listening to, coming to know, appreciating, welcoming the stranger. Back into the early part of Genesis, it really starts in Genesis 13, I believe it is, when Abraham and his nephew Lot, they have too much livestock and they need more space, so they decide they need to split ways. And Lot went to the east to settle in Sodom. Pretty quickly we learn that Sodom is known to be made up of extraordinarily wicked, bad, awful people. A lot of things happen in the way. I'm going to give a really quick piece on it because the story of Sodom is really, I believe, terribly misunderstood by so many in our culture. There's a piece where Abraham greets 3 strangers, and then next chapter in, it's Lot. And these 2 strangers at this point come to the gates of Sodom, and Lot races out to meet them. And he takes them and he tries to secret them away in his house because he's so fearful of what the people of Sodom will do to strangers. And he treats them like royal guests, feeds them well, hosts them, cares for them, but somehow word gets out that there are strangers in their midst. And the men of Sodom show up at Lot's house, and they demand that he send out these two strangers. And this is the twisted piece, I think especially, that Lot instead offers them his virgin daughters. Take them instead, because he knows that whoever is sent out is going to be abused. And it sounds awful, it sounds like a terrible thing until we remember that this is story. It's meant to lift up a larger point. And it's not about how we should treat our daughters. It's not saying, oh, just let your daughters get sent out and literally be raped. But they demand instead the strangers. And again, the story of Sodom involves what? The idea of what? Men with men. People think it's a statement against people in acts that are, well, I guess what we might term as homosexual. And that's not the point of the story at all. The reason the men of Sodom wanted them is it was a customary thing. It still is to this day in some cultures. If you're warring against another people, and the Sodomites were in war at that time with other groups, the thing that one of the best ways to dehumanize, to humiliate your enemy, is to rape them. And that's really what they were seeking to do. So Lot, being threatened, it was actually the really quick version, is these two strangers help get them out of town. And God is going to destroy Sodom. So the good news for the people of Israel, who were a wandering people, was the importance of welcoming the stranger. And that reminder of you need to hear and know and take seriously the stranger as a full human being in their humanity. But what's that last piece in it? Do you remember what happened when they're told don't look back? And what happened? His wife turned back and looked. So what's that about? Well, the suggestion I'd like to give that has some validity is she actually found something enamoring about the people of Sodom and didn't want to let go of it. So again, the point of the story early on in Scripture sadly gets misused, abused in being shared as a statement against a people when it's actually the exact opposite. The point of the story was the welcome embrace of the other, the different, the stranger. And sadly, so many people of faith use it as an excuse to have judgment against a whole group of people based in their sexuality. Whew, that was more than you probably wanted, but we said within 15 minutes each. No. And I think, Joy, were you the next in order?
I've got Acts.
That's a toss-up. I'll go next. So I chose a story that comes from Matthew 15. And this is actually an exchange that occurs between Jesus and between a woman who's described as a Canaanite or a Syrophoenician. And in this exchange, the woman has been pursuing Jesus and the disciples for a little while, and she sounds like she's kind of a little loud and obnoxious, like we're kind of told that she is crying out loudly again and again. And the disciples aren't thrilled about it, and they kind of want her to, buzz off, go be quiet. But she gets to Jesus one way or another and begs, makes her plea, will you heal my daughter who's suffering from some kind of malady that they were probably not fully able to understand, but the way she expressed it was demon possession. That was the way that she perhaps understood that, and asked for healing for her daughter. And Jesus gives a rather bizarre response, which is no. He sort of says, I'm not here for you. I'm here for my people, or the people that I feel specifically called to. So she gets a no, which is just weird to begin with, right? Is it strange to think of Jesus turning down someone who's just asking for healing for their daughter? And she persists. She tries again. She says, please, I'm asking for this is well within your wheelhouse, Jesus. This is something that I know you do. Will you heal my daughter? And we get this crazy line where Jesus appears to be using some really derogatory language for her and suggests that healing her daughter would be something like throwing good food to the dogs, which is like just an awful thing to even think about on Jesus' lips. I struggle with how he would say something like that. And she persists yet again. In kind of a humbling comment, and we could talk a lot about how to interpret this, but she says, even the dogs underneath the table, if you're going to choose to use that nomenclature for me, even the dogs get the scraps that are thrown off the table. And in what we can only sort of identify as a reversal, Jesus admires, articulates the value of her faith, maybe her persistence. Maybe we might just understand that as he seems to recognize her spirit and indeed heals her daughter right there on the spot. We could talk a lot, I suppose, about whether we want to interpret this as a moment in which Jesus really has a change of heart. I actually kind of like to believe that that's the case. But even if that feels like a bridge too far, we might say, well, he's set up this object lesson at least to demonstrate that it's possible to sort of hear someone else's story and experience their spirit, be moved by their situation, and change our minds, respond in a different way. So it's always been a powerful story for me.
And so as we were talking about this, thank you. That's a great story. I'll be preaching on that in a couple of weeks. I took notes. So we talked about, wouldn't it be great to show a through line of listening to others' stories, welcoming the stranger from the Old Testament scriptures through the Gospels, and then to the rest of the New Testament. So I chose a scene with Peter and Cornelius, the Roman centurion, from Acts. So in the book of Acts, I'm sure you're all fairly familiar. If you're not, it just tells the story of the first churches. Right after the ascension of Jesus is where it begins, and goes through, and it's basically Peter, and then switches to Paul. And I think Peter's part often gets underutilized, underpreached on. So in chapters 10 and 11, you've got Peter, this devout Jew, who's been told all his life a story about the Gentiles. They're dirty. Don't associate with them. Unclean. They eat these horrible non-kosher foods. You better not talk to them, let alone sit down and have a meal with them. He's been told this story, and he is carrying the message of Jesus with this story in his heart. And then he's confronted with Cornelius. But before he talks to Cornelius, he has this crazy vision, and this is where we can get off, and I won't go. I recommend reading Acts 10 and 11. But he has a whole vision of a four-cornered sheet with all this unclean animals on it. And God tells him, eat of all this. And Peter's like, no, I have followed your laws. I will not eat this. This is unclean. And then in his vision, God says, I have made nothing that is unclean. Nothing I have made is unclean. He wakes up from this vision, and then there's this Gentile, Cornelius, at his door, and he welcomes him in, and then they share a meal together. He's been told this story about these people, and then it's totally turned on its head by a vision from God. But then what's even more amazing, two more parts in chapter 11, after the rest of the community in Jerusalem, here's what he's done. They call him to task. They're like, you violated the story we told you. Those people are bad and wrong. How dare you? They haul him into Jerusalem to reprimand him. And then Peter has to defend his case before the Jerusalem council, which he does, and he tells about the vision, and he turns their hearts, which is just incredible. But it also goes to show that there are powerful social forces that like to keep us believing the stories of negativity about another group. And I also love this because we're all Gentiles, right? There was two kinds of people in the world of Peter's day, Jews and Gentiles. All of us are seen as, we're the dirty ones, we're the unclean ones, we're the ones, how dare you associate with. And so I'm just going to lift up two quick verses of his evolution. So it begins, Peter said to them, you yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. Then Peter spoke to them again. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. The story changed his mind.
Wow, thank you, all three of you. And I love the line that came through those three stories. So coming into non-biblical times and into the current time, what role do you think hearing other people's stories plays in people becoming better Christians. So a guy like me, I'm just trying to live right. And how do you see hearing other stories, contemporary stories, how does that help me become a better Christian? Andrew gave me eye contact.
No, you moved your head. Well, I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question, and there's so much to it. But since Peter already went with some of the more hot button things, I'll just go right into it. I had a conversation with a member of my church who is an older man that has transitioned to a woman. So he was Jeff, and now it's Jessica. And Jeff was part of our church at Trinity years ago, but was totally rejected by the church going through this transition. And then she now came up to me this summer and said, I would love to come back to the church. Do you think they would accept me for who I am? I said, I can't guarantee what everyone would say, but you are welcome here. And Jessica's come every Sunday since June. And before we got to that point, she was telling me her story of why he became she and what struggles that they went through. And I have to be honest, as my political leanings may be obvious or not, but I still struggle with that understanding. I don't understand that, but that doesn't mean I can't accept Jessica. And hearing Jessica's story and the pain that she went through at our church years ago compelled me to say, we should find a way as Christians to mitigate that pain, to show that compassion, to see you as a human being, whether your name is Jessica or Jeff.
Very good. Thank you. Joy?
I kind of want to answer your question like right on the nose and say, in a sense, I think hearing people's stories is the only way we get to be better Christians.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
And I think it's the whole way that Scripture unfolded. We see the unfolding of Scripture as people learned like a little more about God, a little more about how God related to them, a little more about how God was relating to other people, and that all kind of got written down and codified. But we are in dangerous territory when we assume that all of that work wrapped up like a couple thousand years ago. I mean, that's risky business. And I think it gets us in some really problematic spaces. So if we want to know more about how God's relating to people and how God is desiring to relate to us, we have to hear people's stories. I think it is one of the major means through which God is speaking to our hearts now.
Peter, you want to take a shot at that? Thanks, Joy.
I think they got it.
Okay, great. So, Peter, could you share a story from your career where hearing a person's story had an impact on your faith?
Sure. I guess the challenge for me is every single day it happens. But I also think about that so often faith of any type is used to be a corrective for other people, to point fingers at others about their problems, their issues, the things that they need to solve. And yet when I look at the gospel, Jesus' critique was pretty much solely for his own people and not those on the outside. And what he called them to do is not to point fingers, but to look more critically within. Not to be cruel or to be mean, but to think about how they might find their way more closely to God. And so I guess when I think about it's the hearing of the stories, and it's the times that I've presumed something and have learned something different. And I'll give an example from before I was ordained, while I was in seminary and I was working in the Bridgeport Correctional Center in a jail. And it's easy to assume a lot of things about people in prison. The first guy that they had me meet was somebody who had killed quite a few people. Huge guy, violent, looked the case. He was the stereotype of it. I never really got to know him. The next two people I met, though, one was a young black man, 17 years old. He had been arrested because he was found with a gun in school. And I thought, ooh, that's not good. Until I listened to his story. And so many guns were present. And as I listened to him more and more, he was exactly like the kids that I went to high school with. He just happened to be in a community where there was a different form of violence. But his values, what he cared about, all. Then I ran into a guy, young white man, who was the victim of road rage. And somebody cut him off and he got out and he happened to have a sickle in his car and he protected himself with it. And my first reaction was to back off until I got to know him. And he was just scared. And he was reacting to a violent situation like a lot of people do. Doesn't make it okay. But it was coming to know him and no longer vilifying the person, but hearing who they are. And to me, it's that reminder of so many of the assumptions I make. Instead of first trying to see the person as a child of God and trying to understand, not to like necessarily the act, but to know them in the fullness of their being.
Thank you. Pretty random someone would have a sickle in their car.
Here's a pickup truck.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I find myself sometimes saying, in fact, I probably say this a lot internally, what the heck is her story? Or like, what the heck is his story? And it's almost always, I've already judged, right? There's already a negative feeling there. Like someone has done something that I find to be absurd or out of the line, and I'm looking for justification for what I think. How do you help me out of that? I'm one of your parishioners, and I behave that way. Like, what advice do you give me for that going on in my head? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Can you say it one more time?
Well, that was a long story.
I know, but the short version, I think I heard what you're saying, is you're looking for justification for what might be a bias.
Yeah, because I'm always saying, what the heck is their story?
I think I would affirm that you're exercising what I think is one of the first keys to overcoming our biases and our judgments, which is curiosity, actually. Asking what the heck is their story is a good, solid measure better than what a jerk or what an idiot or I can't, I mean, to me, you're already, and I know you're giving us a bit of a hypothetical here, but asking what in the world is actually a step in the right direction. And maybe the next step is to actually ask, what can I help? What's going on? Just tell me about what brought you to this moment, or a measure of curiosity is a good antidote to that rush to judgment that we just naturally often feel when we encounter somebody who is doing or thinking or responding to something in a way that we don't entirely understand. Or
you're leaving the door open. Might be a little crack.
yeah, it's a crack. It's a crack in the door. That's
You're
right.
leaving the door open.
Thank you.
Can I take a stab at that?
Sure.
Don't stab. Just.
You're still thinking that.
I know. I'm a little
stab.
nervous now with the.
I'm going to get into trouble. I'm going to go into some kind of shaky territory that back in 2016, I think it was, when we first started the partnership with the Temple and with the Islamic Society of Akron and Kent for First Serve, I had some people who were very, very angry with me because of our partnering with a mosque. Some who wouldn't talk to me about it. Some who I suspect just have left the church because of it. I was able to meet with a few of them. And the best thing that I was able to do, meeting with Derry, who was clear in his understanding, is to listen first. And as I heard some of the stories, multiple people who shared with me their understanding that now that we know that Muslims are evil, shared, and now that we know that our president at the time, Barack Obama, is in fact a Muslim, and again, the list went on. I don't agree with any of those. To argue the point wasn't helpful, though. And it's better to let that sit for me, to meet the person where they are. And as a person of faith, what was essential to me is to be able to ask the question, okay, let's go with the presumptions. What did Jesus do? And what Jesus did is he went and he met with those people that were vilified, disliked, hated, seen as unclean, as horrible human beings. And he met them where they are. So as a church, at least what I shared, is I think we're compelled to do that if we want to follow what Jesus did. And I think the same thing is true in whatever that bias is that you have. Just to argue it doesn't help us. What's much more helpful is to try to understand how the person came to that place, and then to think about what does faith call us to do, even if that is the case.
Takes a high amount of comfort with being vulnerable, I would think, to enter into that kind of a conversation on both sides. So if I'm interested in hearing someone else's story, and I really want to know, like, what's her story? Do you have any suggestions on how I could approach that? Or how I could help ease that person's fear of being vulnerable and sharing her story with me? Like, how would you help me do that?
I would say give it some time, because I think some people know, what's your story? I want to know, and there's just an aggressive stance that may not even seem like that, but like, what's your deal? Someone's probably going to back away from that. But if you are willing to, take a breath first, slow down, and get to know them, have coffee with them, sit down and chat with them, whatever it is, but find a way to build that trust and comfort first, because someone's not going to be vulnerable and honest if you're just coming at them with, I need to know your answers. And I was at a fundraiser the other day, and there was another person that was there that was like, oh, you're a pastor. Tell me about your story. I was like, whoa. Like, I want to know your call. Like, he just wouldn't let it go. And, I was like, and I've told that story 1,000 times, but I didn't want to tell him. I was like, no. Like,
And I thought you were a nice guy.
Too aggressive.
Because there was no, I didn't think he was, yeah, exactly. I was usually a nice guy, we'll see. But he wasn't giving me any space. He was throwing the questions right at me. What's her deal, right? Just like you said. And I know if he and I had sat down and I had been seeing any kind of sitting back, listening, like, hey, so tell me about it. What was that like? Okay, pause, listen before jumping in. That would be one piece I would say. Don't be like that guy.
Thank you. So let's flip this. Has there ever been a time, we all want to be understood, right? And that's, I think, a basic human desire. So would you be willing to share a time when you really needed to be understood? And just share that story with us and how it impacted you. Just throw that out there, whoever would like to go first.
I find this to be a really vulnerable question, actually. We were just talking about vulnerability. It's a little bit of a hard one to answer, but it caught me. We got to review the questions ahead of time. I'll just be honest with you right now. And it was yesterday, but still. And this question really jumped out at me, and I thought, oh boy, I'm gonna have to answer it. One of the stories that is hard for me to tell on an ongoing basis has been my own journey being a woman in ministry specifically. And you would think, wouldn't you, in 2023, that the journey just wouldn't be much different. You would think, we want to think, I want to think, but it's really different. There are all kinds of little things that happen along the way, and I see a lot of women in the room nodding your heads, so I feel you right now. There are just lots of little things that happen along the way. And I'll tell you one very specific thing. It's recent in my life. I belong to a bunch of different clergy cohorts and fellowships and groups, and one of them is a group in Cuyahoga Falls that has folks from a real blend of different Christian traditions. And on any given day, I bet 60% of the folks in the room do not affirm the call of women to be the lead pastor of a church. That's super weird. It's weird to sit in a room with my fellow clergy colleagues and know that more than half of them don't really affirm my call to ministry or the kind of work that I do. It's just weird. Well, we have been on this journey in this clergy group of sharing, in the parlance of many in the group, our testimonies. And that's language that I know from a time in my own faith journey. It's not language that I always use now. And I lost sleep over this. How do I tell the story of coming up as a woman in ministry and navigating out of a community? I grew up in a community that did not affirm women as pastors. How do I tell that story to a bunch of guys who still don't affirm women as pastors? Man, it was really hard for me. And when I say I lost sleep, I lost sleep. But there was something incredibly healing. It took all of the courage. I am 42 years old. It took 42 years worth of courage to sit in that room that day and just be honest and say that I've had a lot of folks along the way tell me that my call isn't authentic, that I don't belong in this kind of work. But sometimes the healing is just, I think, in telling the story. And I would like to believe that maybe, just maybe, some of those folks might be nudged a little in their own understanding and experience of women in ministry, because I had the guts to tell a little bit of that story. So, long answer to a short question.
Thank you.
I just want to, the guts to share the story. There's risk in sharing your story that needs to be heard. It's also risky to seek to hear another person's story. And I think that's an important part when you say, how do you go about it? Know that if you really want to hear somebody, it may not go well. They may be offended. You may say something that's a trigger word that will upset, or they may think that you're just judging them by doing it. And I think of, again, back to the story of Sodom, that the story of Sodom goes back, again, all the way into the New Testament, in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus talks about Sodom, not about anything to do with sexuality, but when he sends them out to tell and to hear and to come to know other communities, basically says that if they don't welcome you, it's going to be even worse off there than for Sodom. Which is the reminder, sometimes it won't go well. And I've sought to hear stories because I do think it matters that I hear people who are different than me. And I've tried so hard just to listen, just to hear, only to have it come back and really burn me later of, you know what he was really trying to do. It's a risk.
And can I, circling back to the story of telling these male colleagues, taking that risk, I'm not ignorant, and I don't think we're ignorant that, our stories do impact each other in different ways. Like I'm running the risk of dismantling people's strongly held theology that they've had their entire life. I don't take that lightly. I'm not trying to upset everybody's apple cart here. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know that telling my story isn't just about taking risk for me. I'm asking other people to take a risk with their own thinking and their own paradigms. So it's mutual risk taking, and I think being cognizant of what we're asking of people sometimes, or what they're asking of us, and just sitting with that a little bit can be a healthy thing. So.
Great, thank you. Andrew, anything to add to that one?
I just want to, my wife is also a pastor, and she's a senior minister at a church, and then we serve two different churches in Canton. And I will just say the differences in her experience and mine, solely because of gender, we're the exact same. We met in divinity school, exact same training, exact same. She's a better preacher than I am. A wonderful experience, but the differences she has experienced, because she's a woman, have stunned me for the past 10 years. And so I just wanted to reiterate that, say you are not wrong in any way, shape, or form from my perspective, and it has just been an eye-opening thing for me to hear her story and to see the things that she is treated with from the same community, and it's not the same treatment that I get.
And what a great affirmation of somebody whose story is different than yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being vulnerable on that question. I appreciate that. So how do you lead your faith community that you're responsible for. You have a flock that you're responsible for. And how do you lead the church to go out into the big world and listen to other people's stories, or seek to hear other people's stories, rather than just Sunday morning in church?
There's a fundraiser this Thursday for First Serve. But honestly,
That was not a setup.
no, it's not a setup, but it's
right out the park.
real. Because what's the best way to hear stories, to learn, to grow, isn't by one of us standing up ranting. It's about engagement. So my answer was going to just be First Serve. Sorry, you're up.
No, I'm gonna jump in because I had an incredible experience with this, with 92-year-old member of the church, and we adopted a school essentially called the Madjutz Academy before COVID, and I was trying to make the case, it's in Northeast Canton, it's the most dangerous, most impoverished neighborhood, and we should not just give them money and clothing, but we should go and volunteer at the school. This was kind of my big first push in mission when I got there, and there's a lot of hesitation. Well, I don't want to go into that neighborhood, it's not safe, and we've all heard that. And I just said, okay, fine. What if we just did something real simple like a Christmas workshop? We provided toys for them because they can't buy it for their families. What if all you had to do was gather some toys and then be there with the kids? Oh, I could do that. So this became a very successful program where we had our church members lead the young kids, and this is 2nd through 5th grade, young kids through the workshop. And when I went, the comments I heard, particularly from Miss Betty, bless her heart, I love her to pieces. She's still going strong at 98. And she was just like, I had no idea these kids would be so great. Every single one that was there was talking to these kids, was getting their story, was hearing about why they didn't have enough money to get grandma and grandpa toys. And it was just interaction. There was no more agenda than just our people sitting in that school for a morning, talking to some of these kids and taking them around. And the transformation I saw from people who said, no, I'm not going to go there, to, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Those kids are just like my grandkids. But that was one of the most powerful examples I've seen. COVID killed all that, but we're trying to get back to it. Couldn't go into schools.
Thank you. So I'm going off the script here because of your story. So I had an experience working with inner city high school counselors, and I was talking about where the kids live, and said, where do these kids live? And the counselor stopped me and said, we never say that. We always say, where do you stay? Which, I had 38 years in education working with students, and I never understood that. So I was sharing that story a few weeks ago with some friends because they had experienced that a bunch of students that they were interacting with didn't even have beds. But the decision that was made in their minds was the parents, what is wrong with them? Right? It wasn't what I would like to think is, oh my gosh, what can we do? Or how can we help? How do you help us get to a point where we're not blaming or accusing, but we're just taking it for what it is?
One of my central problems with blame is that it doesn't do anything. It doesn't fix any problems, There's a passage in scripture where it's not Jesus talking, it's an epistle writer, says something like, our anger doesn't bring about the kind of righteous life that God intends. And I've always wished that what it said were our judgment doesn't bring about the kind of right, because it doesn't. I mean, we've never fixed any problem ever by judging, blaming, criticizing, running somebody into, nothing gets fixed that way. And so some of it, as kind of probably simplistic as it sounds, is just pragmatically, all the judgment does is mess us up. It doesn't have any effect on anything, really. So moving from a place of, I have these sort of negative emotions going on in me. And I go back to that curiosity idea a lot. What if, or what would it look like if, or could there be something here that I don't understand? Can you replace that initial flash of judgment with a question, whatever that question might be, even if it's just to heal your own spirit and it doesn't go 1 inch past that, you know? I think it can be healing to just flip that statement into a wonder, a moment of wondering.
I wonder if also some of it's about stickiness. And how do we encourage stickiness within ourselves? And stickiness, when I think of that, is a lot of people do something because they think it's an important thing and a caring thing, helping somebody out. Do that until you start judging the person. And then once you start judging the person, go even further until you actually understand their story. Because there's almost always something behind that story that we were judging. Once we understand it, it dismantles it. And I think of Undivided, who's seen the piece Undivided? You need to. Undivided, it's a documentary. We've got copies of it, don't we, Sue? And in it, there's the one story of who was the professional quarterback in there?
Right.
In Portland, Oregon, goes into the poorest school in Portland and volunteers to be an assistant coach to this kid who's the coach. Doesn't know what he's doing, but he's just trying. He cares about these kids. So this former quarterback comes in, thinks he's going to make it all good. It's not working. And there's one kid who's really pretty good. This is a bad version of it. And he's just so angry with this kid because he keeps showing up late. He's showing up tired and until he learns the reason the kid is late is he's trying to find a car seat to put on the bus to bring his child to daycare when he hasn't had food. And you keep going down the list and all of a sudden you realize this is a high school kid and this is what he's facing. I think it's about when you get to judgment, fine, judge, but then trying to learn what's behind it. And watch Undivided, it's awesome.
And I also always love the story of Jesus and the man born blind. And he comes to the disciples, to this man, and the very first question they ask is, who sinned, this man or his father, that he was born blind? Blame. Boom, right there. You've got to find, well, whose fault is this? And Jesus' answer is, it was neither his father nor this man that sinned. He was born blind to show the glories of God as Jesus heals him. And I really, whenever I come to blame or thinking about that story is the first one that pops. There's many others, but that's the first one that pops in the head. It's like, Jesus told us, blaming is not the answer. That is not our path as Christians. We need to get past that.
It also circles us back to something you said earlier, Peter, which is even if we place blame on someone, that still doesn't remove our opportunity to be in relationship with them. You know, even if we've decided that they're distasteful or unclean, to use biblical language or whatever else, those are still the people that Jesus went and hung out with. So it doesn't get us off the hook.
Well, there's that piece about, what does it say about the person without sin be the first to cast that
stone?
rock?
The speck in the log and the eye, all that good.
But
Yeah,
it's
we got a
true.
few of those. Yeah.
So this isn't on here either. So I get irritated when I'm pulling out of Acme and there's somebody there asking for money. Or when I'm going down Route 8 and I'm at every exit and there are people on both sides of the exit. And I have this bad story I tell in my head about have some dignity, man. You know, go get a job. I don't have any interest in hearing that story when that's going on in my head. Right? I'm confessing. So what do you tell me to do? What do I do with that?
We'll go back to 1980 something when I was in seminary in New Haven, Connecticut, and we'd go out at night, these young 20-somethings, and there were always people out in front of the bars and other places, and they were begging for money. And the quick thing to do is, well, they're asking for money for food. Now they're going to go into a bar. Where were we going? It's again, it doesn't mean that it's great that that's what they have to do. But the second piece for me is always, people come here to any church, and they 9 out of 10 times, they have the most elaborate made-up story. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to say you're just trying to take advantage of me. Well, what is it that drives somebody to the place where that's what they're doing to seek to get some support? Right. And it doesn't mean just buying into the story and we need to do more, but somehow somebody's ended up in that place, and how much better if we could understand it. Not just to chuck money at it, but to try to get a clue of what has led that person there. That's all I got.
You triggered me to remember a story. Sue and I took our oldest son Andrew to a Disney thing up in the arena in Cleveland, and we went out to eat first. It was bitter winter. We came out afterwards with our take home, which we had to go put in a car. And there was a homeless person on the sidewalk, and I just walked by, and Andrew, who was about 6, stopped me. He says, "Dad, why don't you give that guy the food?" And I was like, okay, I'm really embarrassed now, right? Because, that's what I should have done instead of grumbling about having to go put it in the car that night. So sometimes those lessons come from the, most interesting places, right? So in this current climate that we're in, this culture we're in right now, people seem to quickly pick sides and make decisions very rapidly, right, without consideration. Can you help us use hearing other people's stories as a way to perhaps modify or help us reconcile or work more towards unity rather than polarization?
You want me to take a stab?
Anybody?
I'll do a really quick one.
Yeah.
I think the key for me is start by actually assuming some integrity in the other person. Mm-hmm. Start by not trying to find the solution, but seeing if you can agree on a common problem. And in faith, we typically should be able to agree on common problems. God calls us to care for people in this, pretty much everything. The solutions can be hugely varied. If at least we agree on the concern and believe then that the other person has integrity and caring about it, then we can have polar opposite ideas of the solution, but we're going to treat each other differently. That's my problem. If there's silence, I fill space.
It's a pastor's thing.
Yeah.
No, I mentioned this, and Peter said I could say it, so I will. You can blame him. But I think we are so polarized, particularly politically, and it's very easy to just assume everyone who's on the other side of the aisle is a bad, evil, whatever person. And so my wife's best friend, when they were growing up, Spokane, Washington, we were visiting them this summer, and they are on the other side of the political spectrum than myself. And I know this, and in fact, some of their friends may have been in DC during January 6th and were part of that movement. So I'm already coming with all these preconceived notions, no, I have to see these people as just like me. So we sat, and I'm not triggered, I'm ready for a fight, but I'm just and she's like, breathe, I'm like, okay, I'll breathe. But it was a test, because I love to preach about how, you should not be this way towards trans people or gay people or anyone from anywhere, black, white, Mexican, whatever. But then this was where I was the one who was like, okay, I assume these people, even calling them that, are going to be someone I can't talk to. And it turns out that it's close friends. So we sat down and we had a meal together, honestly. It sounds so basic, but we broke bread together. We had a meal together. We talked about their kids and our kids, and found the commonalities and learned to ride a bike. Oh, great, tying their shoes. We made these connections on a very human level. And while it was hard for me, it challenged all of my assumptions I think I have, and all the ways I think I'm a great person, right? And I'm like, oh, this is it. But it was wonderful to sit down, even when they're talking about their, AR-47s or whatever those weapons are that are in their houses, and I'm just like, but They raised 3 boys. They're wonderful kids. These kids, the 12-year-old was taking care of babysitting my 6 and 8-year-old, and they were laughing, and they had a hamster, and they had dogs, and they had this wonderful, all they care about is the same things that I do. They want to have food on the table. They want to care for their kids. They want a good world. They just see the world in some different ways of what makes them safe. And it was a real lesson in my humility to just, work through it. So I guess what I would say is, you've got, back to my earlier point, you've got to take the time to sit down and have realize that there's human connections, whether it's a homeless person on the street or whether it's someone from the different political affiliation. But it's not.
It also takes the intellectual maturity or maybe to recognize, right, that perhaps I need to listen to somebody else's story.
Yes.
Right? How do you help people get to that point?
I don't think this is such an abstract question. I think there are lots of very concrete, practical, helpful resources. We would be better off if everyone went and got some training in conflict mediation. Not because you need to go out and mediate the Israel-Palestine dilemma, but because the skills, these are pragmatic, practical, everyday, easy to remember skills that will transform the way that you talk to other people and the way that you're able to hear other people's stories. So I think getting it a little bit out of the realm of the abstract and saying, is anyone else tired of the political polarization? I'm asking. Anyone else, would you like to see a little different climate? And what do you think it's going to take? It's going to take more of us choosing to educate ourselves in very practical, down-to-earth ways that are going to enable us to be in these conversations and have that. Emotional maturity is not, wake up with it one day. It's like earned. Right. It's learned. It's practiced. These are things that we can do, that we can train ourselves a little bit. We can train our emotions and our spirits to not flare up over every little thing. And I think we have to own it as Christians and do it. I think it's in the biblical witness. It's in the witness of our tradition to be peacemakers in that way.
Thank you.
I'm going to just circle back to a piece that always comes to mind for me these days. It is a law scholar from University of Wisconsin in Madison, and was speaking about Muslim scholars. And that she talked about, and it's true in rabbinic tradition and other places, but she was talking about how the greatest imams, the true scholars, how they will argue with each other over the finest points and argue vehemently that they are right, while taking the integrity of the other seriously. But the piece I love is then it was always that they would finish and kind of throw their hands up in the air after they've tried to make their point. But Allah only knows. But God only knows. And again, it's the humility. It's, yes, get down and argue the points. Assume some integrity in the other. Don't assume that there's always a singular perfect answer, but do seek to find the common human need, the common faith concern. You do that, and you're a long ways on the path.
Okay, we're at the final question. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond to this, but what would you offer as advice to individuals in your church that are seeking to deepen their own faith through story listening, story hearing? What would you say to them? How would you encourage your congregation to deepen their faith through story? This is the practical question.
Right.
Did you say you want each of us to answer it?
Yep.
Let me go why they think, and then I won't be the last speaker. Come to this series. Honestly, why are we doing tonight? This is not the most exciting of them. I get it. We've got 2 great ones. But it's not the one that has that edge to it. But it matters that this is where we start in our series, because this is a faith-based thing. We are compelled by faith to do it. So come to this, I know I talk first serve more than some care to, but that's the opportunity to hear other people's stories. Seek out those opportunities where you can have exposure, especially for a lot of us who are in communities that we only hear our own voices. With social media, with so many other things, we only hear one thought pattern. Find ways to experience other. I used to be so negative about semester abroad in college. They'd go and they'd do these silly courses and learn so little. Why waste your time? I could not be more radically changed in that. The opportunity to be in another place and experience. You learn something else, great, but it matters that we expose ourselves. That's what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's hard to say something more than just, yes, you're absolutely right. But no, truly, finding ways to talk to people who are different. I've even preached on this, I don't know if anybody listened, but about if you are in conflict with your sister, brother, even someone in your family, right? Every family has a feud. Intentionally go to them and sit down with them and try to listen to what they have to say. And it's so hard because they're, triggered like that. But to just say, encourage people to get past that and be like, you know what, starting with that basic point, if you truly believe that the political discourse, the family discourse is rotten, and we want to change, right? If you actually believe things should be different than they are, well then, we're all going to have to be a little uncomfortable to get there. And take that moment, be uncomfortable to get there, and sit with the person that you're frustrated with and listen to their story and try to have a meal with, have a beer with, whatever, find a time to just be in dialogue, and also travel. Like I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time abroad, and that changed my life. And there's if possible, no substitution for sitting down in a little village in Guatemala or with people in Thailand or Malaysia, Muslim communities, and hearing their stories and not being the one who you think knows everything in the room, Some of my best experiences in Nairobi, Kenya, where I was the only European for miles around. And I just sat and listened to people talking, and I didn't offer answers or solutions. I just sat and listened. And those experiences, you don't have to go to Nairobi, but it's a pretty cool place. I recommend it, just getting out there and taking some time to get out of that comfort zone.
I will echo something I already said. I think there are really some good skills that we can build. I think doing a training, a workshop, whether it's this Hear My Story series or something that's offered in the community. And the other thing I often tell my congregations is to just change your flight path a little. Very short story. I had a woman a few years back at a previous church I served who started making me these blessing bags. They had a $5 bill and a granola bar and a bottled water, just a little thing, to hand out to those folks who are on the corner who sometimes we don't quite know how to engage with them. And the sad part of this story was that she had made 50 of these, driven around in her car forever and ever, and not passed a single unsheltered person. And she was like, Pastor Joy, can I just give these to you because I don't ever... And my answer was, well, why don't you change your flight path a little? Maybe it's time to take a different route to work, or pick a different grocery store in a neighboring community, or get past the coffee shop that you've always gone to that's kind of your people, and go to one a town over, or pick a different Target, or whatever you got to do, and then make it a thing and bring yourself into a place that isn't your spot and your people and your same crowd all the time. So change your flight path. That's mine.
Terrific. Thank you. To Reverend Fenton Jones, Reverend Taylor Peck, and Reverend Wiley, thank you for your thoughts and your sincerity.
Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dave.
Just one last way you can do it. If you think as I do, I think one of the greatest brokennesses, is that such a word?
It is
the
now.
broken parts of the world is our lack of understanding and hearing each other.
Yeah.
So if you want to help change the world in that teeny itty bitty way, come to the next series, the next in the series and the one after, and bring some friends. Mm-hmm. Invite others to come with you just to hear and to listen. And again, the next ones, you all have the pamphlet. We don't need to go through it. there are some amazing groups that will come out to put a human face on other people's stories. So come. Thank you.
Is it possible for some questions and comments from the group out here?
Sure.
We're a small enough group that especially does work.
Well, I think everybody sits here and has I really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you.
But there are a number of things that have occurred to me that I would be interested in mentioning. The last one is you're going to Kenya and being places. I spent years traveling all over the world on business. And sitting down, when you sit down in Saudi Arabia on the floor and have a meal, and those people are condemned by many people because it's a group.
We're on air.
Thank you very much. You're so nice. It just seems to me that there are things that could be perhaps added in without going to great length. But if some little things could be added on or have side studies or something, there are all sorts of possibilities. And I think this is a marvelous start.
Amen.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I think, Peter, you and I had shared some discussions when you first came here when we were talking about the UCC, because there was a lot of dynamic going on at a point in time. And one of the things you said then, which I still remember, was, something comes up that you don't agree with, don't disengage. You disengage, you've just hardened everyone's position and been able to achieve nothing. So, for me, I try to say, try to understand. It's not always easy, okay? But, and stay engaged and just that level of just stubbornness or determination or tenacity that to keep trying until you do understand, because, seek to understand before you try to be understood.
I need to say amen again.
Y'all should have been on the panel.
No doubt.
That's a great quote. Seek to understand before being understood.
Yes.
It's St. Francis.
Is it?
It's
Yeah.
credited to St. Francis of Assisi, yeah.
Since what you did today.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Patty?
It was just a comment. We were having a conversation about having interracial friends and not having everybody just be lily white. And the individual made I don't have any black friends, where would I find one? But it was meant very, and like, how would they were serious. And I basically said, well, you need to get yourself involved in groups that are not just like you. And it's hard. There are people, but she was serious when she asked me this. How would I do that? I don't know anyone. And that just really, to me, spoke to the whole, you are not extending your boundaries, and you're not going to get anywhere if you don't try and look beyond.
And God bless her that she was trying to take that first step and saying, how do I?
Yes.
When we did a series online, the Lenten study, and we had people who might be seen as other, and one of them was Ahmed Deeb, a friend of mine who's now the imam out in Toledo. And afterwards, I had a voicemail a couple days later on my phone here, and the person on the other end said, it was just such a great session. We realized, can you get us a Muslim? Can you get us a Muslim? At first, I cringed a little bit, and I thought, ooh, that sounds all wrong. And yet, they were right. It's the right step. And it was phrased in a funny way, and I got a little bit, but yeah, it was that I want to reach out, I want to hear more. It sounded a little bit like we were going on Amazon, but that wasn't what was being expressed. So again, that's not a judgment. In fact, it's an affirmation. They got it right, even though my first thought was, what? Get us one? Thank you.
Very good. Anyone else?
There's food otherwise.
All right. Yeah. Terrific. Well, thanks for your time this evening.
And thanks to these two
Thank
who
you.
have been our guests. these two.
These two. Thank you.
You both have two last names. How can we get them?
I know. That's not fair, is it?
Your mic's. Mine now is off.
Okay.